Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, I'm Annie, and I'm here today with Stuart Skelly, who's one of our Senior Data Protection Consultants here at URM. Welcome to another episode of Talk DP. So today we're going to be discussing the enforcement actions that have been delivered since the beginning of 2023 by the UK's privacy regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office, or the ICO. So to kick us off, Stuart, can you give us a brief overview of the different types of enforcement action that's available to the ICO?
Yes, sure, Annie. Under the Data Protection Act 2018 and the UK GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, the ICO has three main enforcement tools in its armoury. These are enforcement notices, which are formal notices directing organisations to either stop doing something unlawful under data protection law or start doing something which is a legal obligation. They're legally obliged to do under that law. The second form of enforcement available to the ICO are reprimands, and those are official tellings off for unlawful activities which the ICO has identified by organisations. And finally, there are, of course, the monetary penalties, or fines, as we all know them. Now, in this podcast, we'll be concentrating on the fines and reprimands. That's basically because enforcement notices are often issued along with fines. So there's quite a big degree of overlap between the enforcement notices and the fines. So it doesn't make sense to look at enforcement notices separately.
In 2023, what was the breakdown of fines and reprimands from the ICO?
In 2023, last year, there was 17 fines imposed by the ICO, none of them on public authorities. They were all issued against private sector organisations. And that figure, 17 fines, was half the number for the preceding year, 2022. The 17 fines, the 17 2023 fines broke down as 16 were issued under the so-called PECR regulations, or the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations, which are the electronic marketing rules. So 16 out of 17 for the PECR breaches of the PECR regulations. Sometimes people forget that the PECR regulations are part of the ICO's remit, as well as the Data Protection Act and UK GDPR, and the UK Freedom of Information Act as well, of course. So there was 16 of the 17 fines were for infringements of PECR, and the one for the UK GDPR was the massive £12.7 million fine issued to TikTok, its US parent, TikTok Inc., and its UK subsidiary. For the UK GDPR, there were 29 reprimands handed down by the ICO last year, as well as that one fine imposed on TikTok, as mentioned. Of those 29 reprimands, 20, or about 2/3, went to public sector organisations and 9 to private companies. That compares to 5 GDPR fines, so not 1, 5 in the preceding year, 2022, and 30 reprimands, almost the same number in 2022. However, 24 of those 30 reprimands in 2022, or 4/5 of them, went to public bodies. So that was more than in 2023. There was a drop in the number of public authorities receiving reprimands, both in absolute terms and proportionately. in 2023.
You've mentioned that really massive TikTok fine that was issued last year, but can you give us an idea of the sums involved in some of the other fines issued in 2023?
Yes, the 17 fines imposed by the ICO in 2023 ranged in value from, at the lower end, £30,000 to nearly £13 million at the top end. In total, these fines brought in almost £14 million, £14 million to the Treasury last year. And the average fine in 2023 was £816,000, nearly double what it had been in 2022, though this figure was, of course, skewed by that enormous fine received by TikTok. By way of comparison, the average fine so far this year, 2024, is currently running at about £135,000, not £800,000.
So I know you've done some number crunching of the stats for the first half of this year, as you've just mentioned. Can you give us some other sort of insight into how 2024 is looking compared to the same period last year?
Yep. So during the first half of this year, the ICO recorded a total of 29 enforcement actions. That's fines, reprimands, or enforcement notices, although we're focusing on fines and reprimands in this podcast, as I mentioned. And it brought those 29 enforcement actions against 22 organisations. It's slightly down on the same period, January to June of last year. Of the 22 organisations which incurred those enforcement proceedings in the first half of this year, 13 were public bodies and 9 were private companies. That compares to 15 public authorities enforced against in the first part of 2023 and 13 private sector organisations. So there was a slightly more even split between public and private entities last year. But in both years, public bodies formed the majority of the recipients of enforcement proceedings. One feature that certainly caught my eye from both years' figures, the first half of this year and the first half of last year, Annie, was that of the 15 public bodies that received enforcement in 2023, 6 or 40% of them were either police forces or other law enforcement agencies. And in 2024, that figure has risen to 7 of the 13 public authority recipients of action being either police or other law enforcement bodies. So that's more than half of the public sector organisations proceeded against, in other words. And in the whole of last year, there was enforcement against 10 law enforcement organisations, including no less than 8 police forces. Of the 9 monetary penalties or fines imposed by the ICO in the first half of this year, the large majority, 7 of them, again resulted from infringements of the PEC regulations on telemarketing. That's almost exactly the same level as in the previous, the 6 months of the previous year. Interestingly, the 2 non-PEC regulations fines from this year so far were applied to a government department, the Ministry of Defence, and a charity, the Central YMCA. And that's quite interesting because it's a departure from the ICO's usual policy of not fining public bodies. The regulator tends to issue reprimands to organisations if they're in the public sector. But these 2 fines, one of them quite big, the £350,000 handed down to the Ministry of Defence. These 2 fines were to a public or quasi-public body, a charity. Also interesting, probably relevant to the ICO's decision to fine and not just reprimand these organisations, was that both of the fines related to breaches which involved the disclosure of very sensitive information through their accidental inclusion of data subjects' email addresses in the ordinary CC field, the carbon copy field of multiple recipient emails, rather than using the blind copy or BCC one. So far in 2024, there have been 20 enforcement actions which weren't fines. These comprised 10 reprimands, all against public sector bodies, and 10 enforcement notices, of which 8 were for private sector organisations and 2 for public authorities.
And just to wrap up, Stuart, wanted to ask you how the ICO's track record on enforcement in 2023 and fining organisations in particular, how does that compare with other data protection authorities in Europe?
The thing that's most striking with regard to the fines imposed, Annie, is that the ICO's figures are nowhere near those of the regulators in Europe. For example, in 2023, in France, the regulator, which is called CNIL, so CNIL, the CNIL imposed 36 fines, not 17, totaling 89 million euro, or about 75 million pounds, so a lot more than the ICO's 14 million pounds total. In Spain, moreover, the regulator, the AEPD, issued a huge number of fines, 367, as opposed to the ICO's 17, totaling 30 million euro, or 25.5 million pounds approximately. And finally, in Italy, the regulator there, which is called the Garante, levied 146 fines last year, not 17, and those fines totaled 25 million euro, or around 21 million pounds. So I'm sure the ICO would say that it's not a numbers game, and the point of efficient regulation isn't simply to rack up the biggest number of or amount of fines. However, there is such a vast discrepancy between the figures of the UK regulator and their European counterparts that it's quite hard to understand why the ICO seems to be reluctant to apply fines when some comparable large European data protection authorities seem to find them an effective deterrent.
Are there any trends you can see emerging so far in 2024?
Well, yes, the low number of fines issued by the ICO, and the fact that these tend to be imposed on private sector organisations for breaches of the PEC regulations, as I've mentioned. The fact that police and other law enforcement bodies seem to be overrepresented amongst the public authorities which are enforced against. And finally, the ICO are prepared, despite their policy, to fine public bodies where the infringements committed and the damage suffered by the individuals affected by those breaches have been particularly serious.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And for our listeners who want to learn a bit more about the ICO's enforcement actions and how those break down, Stuart's written, I think, about 4 blogs now on just providing some analysis of the ICO's enforcement actions. He's also done one looking at the enforcement actions delivered by the ICO since the GDPR was introduced in 2018. Would really recommend everyone to go and give those a read. So thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.